What if I told you the most improper stories whispered about Britain's royals weren't invented by gossips at all, just poorly disguised by courtiers with a talent for looking away? What if the scandal wasn't the rumour, but the paper trail that survived anyway? Behind the portraits and processions there are deaths that sound like slapstick until you read the eyewitness accounts. Love lives so documented they became legal problems, and private humiliations that leaked into public policy like smoke under a locked door. Tonight, we're moving through 25 royal rumours that turned out to be stubbornly, inconveniently real, proven by chronicles, court records, letters, medical notes, parliamentary fights, and the kind of contemporary reporting that loved a crown almost as much as it loved watching it wobble. If you want more long, calm history like this, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Now, let's open the doors that were meant to stay shut. The king who burst at his own funeral. For a man who conquered England, William I died in a way that sounds like a cruel joke, then somehow became even worse after death. The setup is straightforward. In 1087, William, older, heavier, and worn down by campaigning, was injured during a raid near Mont. Contemporary chroniclers describe a hard fall against the pommel of his saddle, the kind of injury that doesn't look dramatic until infection and internal damage start quietly doing their work. He died not on a battlefield in glorious armour, but in a room, with attendants watching a powerful body fail in slow, humiliating increment. Except the rumour wasn't just that his end was undignified, it was that his funeral became a public spectacle. Accounts report that when William's corpse was brought to be buried at Caen, the body had swollen, normal enough for the era's limited preservation methods and summer heat. The trouble came when attendants tried to force him into a stone sarcophagus that didn't fit. They pressed, the body resisted, and then reportedly it ruptured. The smell flooded the church. The ceremony collapsed into disorder, with clergy and nobles scrambling to escape the stench. How do we know? Because multiple medieval writers repeat the essentials: the swelling, the forcing, the bursting, the panic. They weren't writing modern tabloid comedy, they were writing moral history. To them, a conquering king ending as a leaking problem was a sermon in flesh, and the consequence is the point. Royal power didn't protect William from biology, and it didn't protect the people around him from the embarrassment of pretending it wasn't happening. The crown can command armies, it cannot negotiate with decomposition. And speaking of royal bodies refusing to behave, let's talk about a king whose appetite became his epitaph, the lamprey feast that killed Henry I. If medieval rumour had a favourite genre, it was king meets a ridiculous end. Henry's death delivered exactly that, except it wasn't ridiculous to the people who recorded it, because they believed they were watching a moral lesson play out. Henry I, youngest son of William the Conqueror, ruled with a reputation for sharp administration and colder instincts. By late 1135, he was in Normandy, aging but still politically active, still trying to keep the machine of rule running. Then comes the dinner that crawls into history: lampreys. Lampreys were a prestige food, strange, expensive, and fashionable. Chroniclers report Henry ate them despite warnings. Whether the warning was about the lampreys themselves, the season, his health, or simply moderation, the narrative survives with a clear shape. The king overindulged, and soon after, he fell violently ill. The pivot is that this doesn't read like a mere stomachache. Accounts describe an illness severe enough to kill him within days. Food poisoning is the simplest explanation, but medieval records don't speak in modern diagnoses. What they do give us is timing, behaviour, and consequence. A king eats the thing he's advised to avoid. He collapses, he dies, and the consequence wasn't just personal. Henry's death cracked the political ice holding England and Normandy together. His only legitimate son had drowned years earlier in the White Ship disaster. Another story that sounds like rumour until you trace the witnesses. With Henry gone, succession became argument, then civil war. An era later called the Anarchy, because a multi-year constitutional crisis with intermittent sieges doesn't fit neatly on a timeline. So yes, the The king died from eating lampreys survives because it's memorable, but it survives even more stubbornly because the sources treat it as true, and because the political aftershock is undeniable. Meanwhile, not every royal disaster comes from dinner. Sometimes it comes from mud, tides, and an entire treasure train vanishing like it was swallowed by the sea. The crown jewels that sank into the wash. King John's reign attracts rumours the way a battlefield attracts crows. Some are exaggerated, some are too neat, and some, unfortunately for John, are confirmed by the fact that nobody ever found the missing wealth again. In 1216, John was already in trouble. The barons had rebelled, Magna Carta had been forced and effectively collapsed, and a foreign prince had been invited to take the English throne. John moved through eastern England under pressure, travelling with baggage, wagons, and the portable reality of kingship: money, plate, jewels, records, and supplies. The rumour is that John lost the crown jewels in a freak accident. The truth is that a portion of his baggage train did disappear while crossing the tidal estuary known as the Wash. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe wagons attempting a route across the shifting sands. The tide turned, the ground became trap, carts sank, animals drowned, goods vanished into water and mud. Whether every single crown jewel went down is harder to pin, because medieval inventories aren't always precise, and later storytellers love a single glittering object more than a messy list of lost valuables. But official loss? Yes. A real disaster? Yes. A king suddenly poorer, angrier, and more desperate? Also, yes. And it matters because John's authority was already hemorrhaging. Losing treasure doesn't just hurt pride. It limits the ability to pay soldiers, reward loyalty, and fund movement. Royal power in this period wasn't an abstract concept. It was literally carried behind you in wagons. If you think that was embarrassing, wait until we get to royals who didn't lose their valuables to tide because their own spouses locked them away like a dangerous secret. The queen, who spent years as a prisoner of her husband, Eleanor of Aquitaine, has the kind of life story that inspires romance, until you notice how much of it involves being treated as property by men who feared her influence. Eleanor was not a minor figure who married into importance. She was an heiress with Aquitaine, one of the richest territories in France, and she carried that power into two marriages that shaped Europe. First, she married Louis VII of France. Then, after an annulment that scandalized polite society, she married Henry II of England, a man with a temper and an empire-building appetite. The rumor whispered in courtly corners was that Henry eventually imprisoned her. The truth is that after their relationship collapsed into open hostility, complicated by Henry's affairs, political tensions, and rebellion by their sons, Eleanor was indeed held in confinement for years. Not in a single dungeon cell for decades straight, the way later melodrama might frame it, but under guarded restriction, moved between residences, her freedom controlled by the king. How do we know? Because administrative records, chronicle accounts, and the political timeline leave fingerprints everywhere. Eleanor disappears from public political life during periods when she had previously been active, and she reappears in ways that match release and re-empowerment, especially after Henry's death, when her son Richard I turns her from constrained spouse into crucial political operator. The consequence is the uncomfortable part. Royal marriage could be a legal cage. A queen could be wealthy, connected, and brilliant, and still become a hostage when her husband decided her agency was a threat. And speaking of husbands terrified of humiliation, let's move from imprisonment to obsession. Because one king's favoritism became so blatant it turned into a national argument about what was happening behind closed doors. The king who couldn't quit his favourites, Edward II, didn't just have friends at court. He had favourites in a way that made contemporaries furious and suspicious. The setup is political, but the rumour is personal. Edward II lavished attention, titles and influence on particular men, most famously Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. In a court system built on controlled access to the monarch, favourite isn't a harmless label. It means the person who can whisper into power and sell that whisper to everyone else. The pivot is that contemporaries didn't describe this as simple friendship. Chroniclers and hostile nobles framed Edward's attachment as excessive, improper, and destabilizing. Some accounts imply romantic or sexual intimacy, others focus on the political reality that Edward behaved as if he couldn't function without them. We have to be careful here because proof of private acts is rare in medieval life. What we do have is a pattern so strong it became policy. Gaveston was exiled under pressure, recalled and exiled again. The Despensers became targets of national hatred. Opposition to Edward wasn't only about taxes or war. It was about the perception that the king's personal attachments were warping the state. And then came the consequences: rebellion, capture, humiliation, and deposition. Edward II is one of the most famous English kings to be forced off the throne. Whether you believe every lurid detail later attached to his end, the core truth remains. The rumour that he was consumed by favourites is supported by how the realm reacted, again and again, like a body rejecting an infection. Remember that, because it sets up the next truth. Sometimes the rumour isn't that a royal marriage failed. It's that the Queen led the charge to destroy her own husband. The Queen who overthrew the king with her lover. If medieval England had a story that sounded too scandalous to be real, it would be this. The Queen took a lover, invaded her husband's kingdom, and helped remove him from the throne. Isabella of France married Edward II as part of diplomacy, but politics didn't keep a marriage warm. Edward's obsession with favourites, real and visible, alienated nobles and humiliated Isabella publicly. Over time, she became less a consort and more a political actor with a grudge and a plan. The rumour was that Isabella had an affair with Roger Mortimer, and that together they plotted against Edward. The reality is that Isabella and Mortimer did become allies in opposition to Edward II, and contemporaries widely believed they were lovers. Again, we can't timestamp private acts like a modern camera, but the political partnership is documented. Isabella fled abroad, built support, returned with an invading force in 1326, and Edward's regime collapsed with shocking speed. Mortimer rose with her, not as a mere soldier, but as a man positioned beside power. After Edward was deposed, Isabella and Mortimer effectively ruled during the early reign of Edward III, until Edward III turned on Mortimer and had him executed. That arc, rise, dominance, downfall, is not rumour. It's in the bones of the political record. The consequence is the real discomfort. Royal legitimacy wasn't only threatened by foreign armies. It could be destroyed from inside the marriage bed with a partner who decided the crown was safer in other hands. And speaking of kings being rewritten into monsters, let's deal with a rumour that literature exaggerated, but archaeology dragged back toward reality. The crookback king who really had a curved spine. Richard III is one of the most gossiped about English kings in history. For centuries the rumours piled up. Deformed body, twisted soul, born to be a villain. Some of that is propaganda dressed as drama, but one physical detail turned out to have a stubborn basis in fact. The rumour, Richard was a crookback. The truth, modern examination of Richard III's remains, identified through a combination of archaeological context and scientific analysis, showed he had scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine, not the grotesque hunchback of theatrical imagination, not a cartoon deformity that makes evil visible, but a real condition that would have affected his posture and silhouette. What does that change? It makes the old whispers more complicated. On one hand, it confirms that contemporaries who noticed something off weren't inventing it from nothing. On the other, it exposes how quickly a real body becomes a political weapon. A curved spine becomes a crooked character. A physical condition becomes proof of moral corruption, because people love a story where nature itself votes in elections. The consequence is that Richard's image was not merely rumour, it was a campaign. After his death at Bosworth in 1485, the Tudor regime benefited from portraying him as illegitimate and monstrous. A genuine medical reality got absorbed into a narrative machine. At least this rumor has a neat ending. Bone and measurement don't care who wins the throne. They just tell you what was there. Meanwhile, some royal bodies weren't used for propaganda after death. They were used as explanations for cruelty while the person was still alive, especially when pain turned into policy. The leg wound that haunted Henry VIII and everyone around him. Henry VIII's reputation is so loud, wives, beheadings, religious rupture, that a quieter truth can sound like rumour, that the king's body, not just his will, helped drive the violence of his later reign. The setup begins with sport and ego. Henry loved jousting, and he loved presenting himself as invincible. In 1536 he suffered a serious accident during a joust. Reports describe him being unhorsed and injured badly enough to be unconscious. In a world without modern trauma care, that kind of blow is not just a bruise, it can change a person. The rumour is that after this, Henry developed a chronic leg ulcer, painful, recurring, and sometimes infected. The reality is that chronic wounds and mobility problems are repeatedly attested in descriptions of Henry's later life. He became heavier, he struggled to walk, he was carried. His leg problems were not a one-week inconvenience, they were a long-term feature of his body, and they intersected with the Tudor court's brutal incentive. A king in constant pain, increasingly immobile, surrounded by advisors and factions is not a recipe for mercy. We should avoid pretending there's a simple medical explanation for tyranny. Plenty of cruel rulers have been perfectly healthy, but it's also naive to pretend the body doesn't matter. Pain changes mood. Infection changes cognition. Limited movement changes dependency on those who control access. The consequence is this. The rumour of Henry's rotting leg isn't trivia. It's a reminder that the state can end up shaped by something as intimate as a wound that won't heal. Because everyone who wants power starts orbiting the injured body like flies around sugar. And speaking of courtly orbiting, next comes a young queen whose bad reputation wasn't invented by enemies because the evidence caught up with her in the most lethal way possible. The teenage queen who really had a secret life. Catherine Howard is often reduced to a single crude sentence, the one who cheated, as if her entire existence was a morality play written to entertain people who never had to survive in a Tudor court. The setup begins with her age and her environment. Catherine was very young when she caught Henry VIII's eye. She came from the Howard family, a powerful clan with every incentive to place a pretty, agreeable girl close to the throne. But Catherine's earlier life, spent in a household where supervision was loose and boundaries were blurry, left behind a trail that didn't vanish when she put on a crown. The rumour at court was that the new queen had a history, not just flirtation but sexual experience, possibly lovers, possibly ongoing attachments. The pivot is that investigators didn't rely on vibes and whispering. They compiled statements, interrogations and confessions. Evidence emerged of Catherine's premarital sexual relationship with Francis Dereham. Then came the more explosive accusation that as queen she had an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, meaning a man with access near the king's private space. We can't reconstruct every private moment with certainty because interrogations happen under pressure, and Tudor justice did not specialise in tenderness. But the basic shape is hard to escape. Names, meetings, letters, and witness statements formed a case that the regime treated as real. Catherine's downfall wasn't a poetic rumour, it became administrative fact. The consequences were brutal and predictable in a system designed to protect the king's ego as national security. Catherine was executed in 1542. Dereham and Culpeper were executed too, with punishments that made a point to anyone watching. Proximity to the Queen's body was treated as proximity to the throne. And speaking of execution for sexual politics, let's move to another Catherine, one who wasn't destroyed for loving someone else, but for daring to have too much influence in the first place. The Queen who really did get her head cut off. Anne Boleyn has been mythologized into a symbol, feminist icon, seductress, martyr, witch, depending on who's holding the pen. The rumour mill around her life was so loud that people sometimes forget the simplest grim truth. She really was executed, and it really did reshape the kingdom. The setup is the most famous marital crisis in English history. Henry VIII wanted a son and wanted Anne. The old marriage to Catherine of Aragon became politically inconvenient. When the papacy wouldn't grant an annulment on Henry's terms, Henry didn't just end a marriage. He restructured religion, power, and law to make himself the authority. The rumour at the time was that Anne was unfaithful, that she had multiple lovers, that she even committed incest with her brother, George Boleyn. If you've ever wondered how a queen can go from being the reason the king breaks with Rome to being a criminal in a few months, the answer is accusation is faster than theology. The pivot is that Anne was arrested, tried, and convicted. The charges were sensational. Many historians argue they were politically constructed, based on flimsy or manipulated evidence. Time to remove Anne and clear the way for Jane Seymour. Yet the machinery that killed her was entirely real. The Tower, the court, the sentence, the imported swordsman from Calais, and the execution in May 1536. So what's the rumour that was true? Not that every charge was true, but that the Crown can manufacture a truth powerful enough to kill. Anne's execution wasn't folklore, it was state action, and it taught everyone in England a quiet lesson. If a queen can be cut down, anyone can. And speaking of queens as political obstacles, there's a darker rumour that lingers like smoke, because the woman involved died suddenly, and it was extremely convenient for the people around her. The queen who died conveniently after a fall. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, is often framed as the good queen because she gave Henry the son he wanted. She died shortly after childbirth, and the court wrapped her death in piety and inevitability. But there's another queen whose sudden death looked, at the time, almost too neat. We're talking about Anne of Bohemia. No, we're talking about a later, more politically combustible marriage. Mary, Queen of Scots' second husband, and the death of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and then Mary's hasty marriage to the Earl of Bothwell. But that's not a queen dying. So let's be precise. The convenient death, after a full rumour, attaches strongly to Amy Robsart, wife of Robert Dudley, the favourite of Elizabeth I. Amy wasn't a queen, but the rumour mattered because it hovered over the possibility of Elizabeth marrying Dudley. If Amy died, Dudley became marriageable. If Amy died suspiciously, Dudley became poison. In 1560, Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place with a broken neck. The rumour exploded immediately. She was murdered, so Dudley could marry Elizabeth. The pivot is that an inquest was held, and it ruled her death a misfortune. Yet even contemporaries were not satisfied. The circumstances were too perfect for scandal. A woman inconvenient to ambition dies alone, with servants allegedly sent away. Was she pushed? Was it an accident? Could illness have caused a fall? We can't prove murder, but the rumour that was true is this. Her death genuinely happened under circumstances that were politically devastating, and contemporaries absolutely treated it as suspicious enough to matter. It effectively killed Dudley's prospects of marrying Elizabeth, because the Queen, careful as a fox in a trap, could not afford to be tied to a man whose wife died in a story people already believed. And speaking of Elizabeth, let's deal with a rumour that sounds like a fairy tale, but is grounded in an uncomfortable political reality. The Queen who never married was surrounded by proposals, pressure, and a constant argument about what she was supposed to be. The Virgin Queen who really did use romance as policy. Elizabeth I's virginity became a brand, painted, performed, and weaponized. The rumour was that she kept suitors dangling, not because she couldn't choose, but because she liked the power. That sounds like gossip. It's also essentially accurate. The setup. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom with deep religious division, foreign threats, and a political culture that believed a woman without a husband was unfinished business. Every major power in Europe wanted to either marry her or control her. Parliament repeatedly pressed her to marry and produce an heir. Courtiers tried to influence the choice because whoever became closest to the Queen might become closest to power. The pivot. Elizabeth negotiated marriage like diplomacy. She entertained proposals from foreign princes, used flirtation as leverage, and withheld final commitment. This wasn't childish indecision, it was strategy. By keeping the possibility open, she extracted concessions, bought time, and avoided handing England to a foreign dynasty or empowering a domestic faction through a royal husband. Did Elizabeth have lovers? Rumours persist, especially about Robert Dudley. Proof is elusive, but the policy use of romance is not elusive at all. It's in the letters, the ambassadorial reports, the parliamentary debates, the repeated pattern of almost that never becomes yes. The consequence, Elizabeth kept personal sovereignty in a world built to take it from her, but she also created the succession problem that would haunt the end of her reign. A queen can postpone marriage, she can't postpone mortality. And speaking of mortality, the next rumour is a bleak one, that a royal life, despite privilege, could be physically miserable, because medicine, hygiene and childbirth didn't care about titles. The queen who really lost child after child, royal fertility, was treated as national infrastructure. When a queen became pregnant, it wasn't private, it was political. And when pregnancies failed, rumours sprouted like mould in damp stone. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, is a case where the rumour of bad luck is simply the documented tragedy of repeated pregnancy loss. Over years, Catherine experienced multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Only one child, Mary, survived infancy. The pivot is that people at the time searched for explanations that matched their beliefs. Some blamed Catherine's age, some blamed Henry's behaviour, some blamed God's judgment. Henry himself used the lack of a surviving son as part of his argument that the marriage was cursed, claiming it violated biblical law because Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur. Modern medical speculation exists, but the core truth is simple and harsh. The record shows repeated loss, and the dynasty's anxiety about succession was not a vague fear. It was rooted in graves. The consequence is that private grief became public crisis. Henry's obsession with an heir wasn't just vanity. It was also the fragile reality that one child's death could change the entire political map. Catherine's pregnancies became ammunition in Henry's later campaign to replace her. And speaking of replacing wives, let's move to a rumour that gets repeated because it's so neat it feels like a nursery rhyme. Yet the body count is real. The king who really married 6 times and destroyed 2 wives. Henry VIII is the easiest target in royal gossip because you don't have to exaggerate him. Just read the sequence aloud. The rumour, Henry VIII had 6 wives, and he had 2 of them executed. Sometimes it gets recited like a joke, as if it's a harmless mnemonic. The reality is exactly that. Henry married Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were executed. Catherine of Aragon was discarded through a legal and religious war. Anne of Cleves was divorced. Jane Seymour died after childbirth. Catherine Parr survived him. The pivot is that these aren't just personal failures. Each marriage had political consequences. Alliances, faction fights, religious shift. Henry's marital life became the mechanism through which England lurched between ideological directions. People's careers rose and fell depending on which queen was favoured. The consequence is that romantic scandal becomes state violence. Wives became trophies, then targets, and the court adapted by learning the most dangerous skill of all, pretending to believe whatever Henry believed that week. If you think that was dark, remember, some royal rumours aren't about who married whom. They're about who died and who benefited. The princes in the Tower who really did disappear. Few stories in British history have the gravitational pull of the princes in the Tower. The rumour is that 2 boys, Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were murdered. The truth we can state with certainty is both simpler and more haunting. They were seen, then they vanished, and they were never publicly produced again. The setup. In 1483, Edward IV died, leaving a young heir, Edward V. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became protector. The boys were lodged in the Tower of London, which at that time functioned as both residence and fortress, normal enough for a young king before a coronation. The pivot. Richard took the crown himself as Richard III, declaring the boys illegitimate. And then the boys disappeared from view. Contemporary sources note the lack of sighting. Rumours spread that they were dead. Later accounts accused Richard III directly, while others proposed alternative culprits or timing. Do we have a signed confession? No. Do we have bodies conclusively identified? No. But the rumour that was true is this. The disappearance happened. It was politically decisive. And even at the time it was treated as a scandal so plausible, it shaped reputations for centuries. The consequences were enormous. Richard III's legitimacy was questioned. The Tudor claim later relied on portraying Richard as a child murderer to justify a new dynasty, and the tower, stone and shadow, became a national symbol of vanished innocence. And speaking of symbols that outgrew their facts, let's tackle a rumour that sounds absurdly modern. The idea that a monarch could be mentally unwell in a way everyone knew, but nobody could publicly say. The Mad King who really did have episodes of severe illness. George III is remembered through a nickname that's both cruel and revealing. Mad King George. The rumour is that he went insane. The truth is more specific. George III experienced repeated periods of severe illness that affected his behaviour and ability to rule, leading to a regency. The setup. George III reigned for decades, a long span that included the loss of the American colonies, war with revolutionary and Napoleonic France, and enormous domestic changes. His public image was that of a dutiful, moral monarch, family man, steady hand. The pivot. He suffered episodes marked by agitation, confusion, and behaviour that contemporaries recognised as serious. Doctors were involved, treatments were attempted. Parliament had to wrestle with the constitutional question of what happens when the king cannot function. Modern debates exist about diagnosis. Porphyria was once popular as an explanation. More recent scholarship leans toward other possibilities, including psychiatric illness. But the documented reality is clear. He had incapacitating episodes, and by 1811, his son became Prince Regent, effectively ruling in his place. The consequence is that monarchy, often marketed as stable tradition, was forced to confront human fragility at the top. The state had to keep moving even when the king's mind or body could not. And speaking of the monarchy moving on, the next rumour is about a queen whose personal grief became public theatre, changing how the crown looked for generations. The queen who really hid for years after her husband died. Queen Victoria's mourning wasn't a private sadness, it became a national mood. The rumour is that after Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria withdrew so completely that people wondered whether monarchy was still functioning. The truth is that she did retreat from public life to an extent that alarmed politicians and frustrated the public. The setup. Victoria and Albert's partnership was unusually tight for royal marriage. Albert wasn't just a spouse, he was an advisor and organizer. His sudden death, likely from illness after a period of stress, shattered Victoria. The pivot. She wore black for the rest of her life. She avoided public appearances. She stayed at Osborne and Balmoral. She communicated through papers and ministers, but she became physically absent as a symbol. This wasn't mere gossip. It was widely discussed, criticized, and politically consequential. Republicans and reformers used her absence as evidence that monarchy was expensive and unnecessary. Popular resentment rose. The consequence is that Victoria eventually re-emerged in a more carefully managed way, and her later image, the widowed, dutiful empress, became part of the monarchy's brand. But the rumour of her retreat is simply documented behaviour. The crown's public face went missing, and the system had to cope. And speaking of coping, let's get to a rumour that sounds like low gossip until you realise it involved actual political secrecy, locked doors, and national anxiety. The royal marriage that really was a disaster from day one. George IV, when he was Prince of Wales, married Caroline of Brunswick in 1795. If you've ever heard the rumour that they hated each other on sight, you're not dealing with exaggeration. The relationship was catastrophic almost immediately. The setup is transactional. George needed money, Parliament and his father wanted him to marry suitably. Caroline, a German princess, arrived to become a British royal bride. The pivot. Accounts from the period describe George being repulsed and resentful, and Caroline being awkward, loud, and mismatched to the delicate expectations of the English court. Their marriage produced a daughter, Princess Charlotte, and then effectively collapsed. They lived apart. The hostility became public knowledge. Later, when George became king, he attempted to divorce Caroline and strip her status. This led to the infamous Queen Caroline affair and the Pains and Penalties Bill in 1820, which turned royal domestic misery into a national political battle. Crowds sided with Caroline, pamphlets flew, the monarchy looked petty and cruel. The consequence is that the royal family became tabloid entertainment long before tabloids existed. The Crown learned again that private disgust can become public crisis when people feel they're paying for the theatre. And speaking of theatres, there's a rumour so persistent it became almost a Victorian ghost story. A secret royal marriage hidden because it threatened the succession. The secret marriage that really did happen and caused a constitutional panic. If Britain had a talent for burying inconvenient romance under layers of law, it reached a fine, twitchy peak with the Prince of Wales, later George IV, and Maria Fitzherbert. The setup sounds like the plot of a melodrama written by a lawyer. In the 1780s, the Prince of Wales was deep in debt, surrounded by political pressure, and expected to marry a suitable Protestant princess for the good of the dynasty. Then he fell hard for Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic commoner, exactly the kind of woman the system was designed to forbid. The rumour was that he married her anyway, in secret. The pivot is that this wasn't just whispered poetry. Contemporary accounts, private correspondence, and the behaviour of the people involved support that a marriage ceremony took place in 1785. Under the Royal Marriages Act, the prince needed the monarch's consent. Under the rules governing succession, marrying a Catholic created an explosive problem. So even if they considered themselves married, the state could treat it as invalid and politically dangerous. And then came the public performance. When Parliament needed to address the prince's finances, the existence of a secret marriage threatened to blow everything open. The prince's allies issued formal denials. Friends made statements intended to bury the story. Meanwhile, Fitzherbert was treated, quietly, privately, as if she had a claim. The consequence is the uncomfortable truth. The heir to the throne tried to have a private life in a system that turned private life into constitutional machinery. Everyone lied not because romance is scandalous, but because the law made it radioactive. And speaking of heirs behaving badly in ways everyone knew, the next rumour isn't about secret wedding. It's about a prince who behaved like a walking vice list and left enough evidence to make the whispers boringly real. The playboy prince who really did turn scandal into a lifestyle. Before Edward VII became a rotund symbol of late Victorian confidence, Bertie was the Prince of Wales. Young, privileged, and followed by rumours that he treated rules as suggestions and women as scenery. The setup is the court's least surprising secret. The heir was expected to appear respectable, but he was also expected to be a man. Victorian hypocrisy loved a double standard, and Bertie lived inside it like a man renting a palace. The rumour was that the Prince of Wales had serial affairs, kept mistresses, and made a habit of scandals that would have ended a lesser career. The pivot is that this wasn't built from one angry pamphlet. Contemporary society gossiped about named women, named houses, and named weekends. Bertie's friendships and romantic entanglements were so widely discussed that they became part of how people explained politics and patronage. He wasn't merely a private rake. He was a public figure whose appetites were an open secret, and we know it mattered because it occasionally broke through the wall. His behaviour fed constant anxiety about whether the monarchy was becoming a moral farce. Victoria herself, who did not enjoy being embarrassed by her own son, spent years treating him like a disappointing schoolboy. With a budget large enough to sink ships, the consequence is that the Crown learned a lesson it never stopped learning. When the heir misbehaves, the institution doesn't just absorb the damage, it gets reshaped by it. The court becomes less about virtue and more about managing headlines, whether those headlines are printed in newspapers or carried by human mouths. And speaking of scandal breaking through walls, the next one literally dragged the heir into a courtroom, because gambling and aristocratic lies can only be contained for so long. The card game scandal that forced the heir to testify. If you want a story that proves royal rumours sometimes come with transcripts, meet the Tranby-Croft baccarat scandal, where the Prince of Wales ended up in the humiliating position of being a witness in a very public legal mess. The setup begins in 1890 at a country house gathering. Baccarat was played. Money moved. A guest, Sir William Gordon Cumming, was accused of cheating. The accusation didn't stay private because private becomes impossible when honour, reputation and class panic collide. The rumour was that the Prince of Wales was involved, present at the table, part of a cover-up, and part of the aristocratic pressure campaign to keep the scandal quiet. The pivot is that the matter went to court. Gordon Cumming sued for libel after being branded a cheat, and the Prince of Wales was called to give evidence. That detail alone tells you how far it went. The heir to the throne, embodiment of national dignity, had to sit in a courtroom while lawyers and newspapers circled the story like gulls. The case ended disastrously for Gordon Cumming, but the monarchy did not walk away clean. The public saw in granular detail how elite circles handled accusations, quiet agreements, forced promises, and a desperate attempt to keep the stain contained. The prince's presence, calm, polished, and unmistakably implicated by proximity, turned a social mess into a constitutional embarrassment. The consequence was lasting. The rumour that the elite played by different rules stopped being an opinion and became something people felt they'd watched happen. And speaking of rules bending around royal desire, the next truth is older and more brutal. A king whose love life wasn't a rumour at all, but practically a staffing policy. The king who really ran a court of mistresses and made it politics. Charles II is remembered as the Merry Monarch, which is a cheerful label for a reign that included plague, fire, and enough political cynicism to curdle milk. But the rumour that stuck to him most stubbornly was also the simplest. He kept a parade of mistresses and everyone knew it. The setup is restoration culture after years of civil war, regicide, and Puritan severity. When Charles returned in 1660, court life swung hard in the opposite direction, and pleasure became a kind of political statement. A king who laughed, flirted, and attended the theatre was proof that the old world had returned. The rumour was that Charles's court was openly sexual, and that he fathered illegitimate children like it was a royal side project. The pivot is that this is not speculation. We have names, titles, and consequences. Mistresses such as Barbara Villiers and Nell Gwynn were publicly recognised figures. Royal bastards were acknowledged and elevated, woven into patronage networks, and used in the soft architecture of power. The king's affection could change someone's fortune. His attention could turn a woman into a political node. The consequences were both personal and national. Courtiers aligned themselves with mistresses to gain access. Factions formed around bedrooms, and the public watched a monarchy that had been restored as a symbol of stability behaving like a glamorous disaster, and, strangely, surviving it. And speaking of glamorous disasters, the next rumour is quieter but sharper. A queen whose friendship with a servant became so scandalous that people invented insulting nicknames just to process what they were seeing. The queen who really bonded with a servant in a way that shocked the nation. Queen Victoria's relationship with John Brown is one of those royal stories that gets treated like gossip until you notice how hard the palace worked to control it. The setup is grief. After Albert died, Victoria became a widow wrapped in black, and she retreated from the public eye with a ferocity that worried ministers. Into that lonely world stepped John Brown, a Scottish servant and attendant at Balmoral, blunt, physically present, and not impressed by royal fragility. The rumour was that Brown was more than a servant, that the Queen depended on him emotionally, perhaps romantically, perhaps even secretly married to him. The pivot is that while secret marriage claims remain unproven and disputed, the closeness itself is documented enough to make the palace uncomfortable. Brown had access. Brown had influence. Brown spoke to the Queen with a familiarity that outraged courtiers. Victoria defended him fiercely. Contemporaries noticed. They mocked. They whispered. They turned the story into a national joke with sharp teeth, because the idea of a queen leaning on a working man threatened the class script that monarchy relied on. And then there's the paper trail of embarrassment, efforts to destroy or hide material after Victoria's death, the careful management of her image, the discomfort around how much she relied on him. When an institution tries that hard to control a narrative, it tells you the narrative had power. The consequence is that the Crown's most famous widow wasn't simply alone. She was human in a way that made people angry, because monarchy is meant to be distant, and grief makes distance difficult. If you think that was messy, the next rumour is bluntly romantic and bluntly true. A king who gave up the throne because he refused to give up a woman. The king who really abdicated for the woman he would not give up. Edward VIII's abdication is so famous it can feel like a myth, like a modern fairy tale where love defeats duty. But the truth is less fairy tale and more constitutional car crash. He really did give up the throne, and the reason really was his determination to marry Wallis Simpson. The setup begins with a monarch who didn't fit the job. Edward VIII became king in January 1936, after George V died. Edward was charismatic, modern-seeming, and allergic to the suffocating rituals of kingship. He also had a long history of affairs, and by the time he took the throne, he was emotionally committed to Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who was in the process of divorcing her second husband. The rumour was that Edward would choose her over the crown. The pivot is that he did. The political problem wasn't only that she was divorced, it was that she would be a twice-divorced woman, with ex-husbands still alive, in a monarchy still entangled with the Church of England's moral expectation. The government, the Commonwealth, and the establishment were not prepared to accept her as Queen Consort. Edward, stubborn and naive about constitutional realities, refused to let the relationship go. In December 1936, he abdicated. His brother became George VI. Edward became the Duke of Windsor. The consequence is enormous. The monarchy's modern identity, duty, restraint, family respectability, was forged in the shadow of Edward's choice. George VI's reluctant reign and later Elizabeth II's emphasis on service carried the implicit message, never do that again. And speaking of royals whose private lives became national crises, the next rumour is a recent one, but it fits an old pattern. The heir whose marriage collapsed under the weight of attention and whose wife's suffering became a public moral reckoning. The princess who really said she was unhappy, and the world heard her. Diana, Princess of Wales, didn't just become famous. She became a global mirror, reflecting obsession, pity, anger, and the public's appetite for intimate pain served as entertainment. The setup: Diana married Charles in 1981, a wedding presented as national romance. The reality was a young woman entering an ancient system with rigid expectations and little emotional support. Charles, older and emotionally entangled with Camilla Parker Bowles, did not arrive as a clean slate. The rumour was that the marriage was cold, that Charles had continued a relationship with Camilla, and that Diana was profoundly unhappy. The pivot is that Diana said so herself, publicly in interviews that detonated the palace's control over narrative. She spoke about bulimia, loneliness, pressure, and the sense of being trapped in a role where she was both idolised and erased. Charles later acknowledged his own infidelity in a televised interview. The rumour became confirmed reality. The marriage was broken, and the institution did not know how to handle a woman who could speak directly to the public with emotional force. The consequence was a transformation of royal media reality. The monarchy could no longer assume it controlled the story. Diana's life and death permanently altered public expectations of transparency, empathy, and accountability. And speaking of death and accountability, the next rumour is one of the darkest modern ones. Whether the system's failures, press intrusion, lack of protection, relentless pursuit, played a role in a tragedy everyone watched unfold. The car crash that really was chased by cameras. Whenever a famous person dies, conspiracy grows like ivy, filling gaps, clinging to grief. Diana's death in Paris in 1997 became a magnet for such stories. But one part of the rumor is not conspiracy. It's documented. Paparazzi were aggressively pursuing the car. The setup is the climate of the 1990s when celebrity photography was both lucrative and relentless. Diana, newly divorced, was a primary target. On the night of August 31st, she left the Ritz in Paris with Dodi Fayed. The car entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. It crashed. Diana and Dodi died. The driver, Henry Paul, died. Bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones survived. The rumor was that the crash happened during a paparazzi chase. The pivot is that investigations and contemporary accounts established that photographers on motorcycles were indeed following. The exact dynamics, speed, route choices, the driver's impairment, seatbelt use, formed a complex chain. But the pursuit itself wasn't a fairy tale. It was part of the night's reality. The consequence is grim and familiar. The public appetite for images created conditions where risk became routine. Diana's death forced a shift in how people viewed the press, privacy, and the ethics of pursuit. It also exposed how the monarchy's relationship with media could enable a dangerous ecosystem, one that fed on royal lives until it ended in death. If you think that was the last time the monarchy collided with modern scandal, remember, the institution can survive many things, but it struggles most when the rumor points toward moral hypocrisy inside the family itself. The royal who really paid a heavy price for a friendship with, say, a fallen figure. Certain modern royal rumors are legally sensitive because they involve living people and ongoing disputes. But there is a broad truth here that's undeniable. Association itself can become the scandal, and attempts at damage control can deepen it. The setup is that members of royal families often move in elite circles where wealth, influence, and wrongdoing sometimes overlap. When a figure later revealed as criminal or abusive appears in those circles, the question becomes, who knew what and when? The rumor was that a senior royal maintained a relationship with a notorious, disgraced man and tried to minimize the optics afterward. The pivot in the modern era is that public documents, interviews, and institutional responses can create a record of association regardless of private intent. The consequences can include removal from public duties, reputational damage, and a permanent stain that no amount of ceremonial pageantry can erase. Because this topic can slide into unverified claims quickly, the key, true element we can safely anchor is the documented fallout. Associations were publicly scrutinized, institutional roles changed, and the monarchy's brand suffered. The consequence is that modern monarchy is not only about what a royal does, it's about what they're seen near, and how they respond when that proximity becomes morally radioactive. And speaking of proximity and optics, let's turn to a rumor that sounds like the stuff of cartoon cruelty, but is grounded in the very real reality of royal medical interventions and the public's morbid fascination with them. The royal births that really were public spectacle. For centuries, royal births weren't intimate family events. They were political events, and in some cases they were treated like something the public had a right to witness. The setup, succession crises made people paranoid. If a child's legitimacy was questioned, it could trigger civil war. So the state did what paranoid states do. It tried to control proof. The rumor is that royal births were sometimes attended by officials and witnesses to ensure the baby was real, not swapped in secret. The pivot is that this happened. In early modern Europe and in Britain, protocols sometimes required the presence of courtiers, doctors, and officials. The most infamous British example often discussed is the birth of James Francis Edward Stuart in 1688 to James II and Mary of Modena, where rumours later claimed the baby was smuggled in a warming pan. In response to such paranoia, later royal households leaned heavily into witnessing and documentation to prevent doubts. Even when not literally public, The births were monitored in ways that would feel invasive today. Queens and princesses were expected to produce heirs under scrutiny, and their bodies became national property. The consequence is a nasty truth. Monarchy monetizes and politicizes reproduction. People joked about royal fertility, but the jokes were anchored in an institution that treated childbirth like state infrastructure. If you think that was invasive, wait until we talk about the way royal bodies were managed even after death, sometimes in ways that sound like rumor because they're so coldly practical. The king who was really displayed as a warning. When politics gets desperate, bodies become messages. And one of the most chilling truths in British royal history is how the remains of a king could be treated after execution. Charles I was tried and executed in 1649 after the English Civil War, an event so shocking that it echoed through Europe. The rumour is that after his death, his body became a kind of relic and political symbol, and that the regime used his execution as a warning. The pivot is that the execution was public and deliberate. The monarchy had been cut down not by foreign invasion, but by domestic revolution. Afterward, Charles's memory became contested territory. Royalists treated him as a martyr. Parliamentarians treated his death as a necessary political surgery. Accounts of how his body was handled, buried quietly, later venerated, show how a royal corpse can become a propaganda for both sides. The consequence is that the crown's sacred aura took a wound it never fully healed. Even after the Restoration, the memory of a beheaded king lingered like a ghost in the Constitution, proof that monarchy is not invulnerable. And speaking of beheading, we need to address a rumour that clings to an earlier queen, that she was executed not just for politics, but for being the wrong kind of queen in the wrong kind of country. The queen who really was executed after years of being a political hostage. Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of those figures whose life reads like an overwritten tragedy. Too many betrayals, too many castles, too many letters, too much blood, which is why people assume the darkest parts must be rumour. They aren't. The setup is that Mary was a crowned queen with an unstable country, a contested religion, and a blood claim to the English throne that made her presence feel like a lit match in a room full of dry straw. After the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, and her disastrous marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, Scotland turned against her. She abdicated. She fled south in 1568, expecting Elizabeth I, her cousin and fellow queen, to offer help, except what she walked into was not rescue. It was a long-term containment. Mary spent nearly 2 decades in England under guard, moved between houses, watched, limited, treated less as a guest and more as an insurance policy. The rumour was that Elizabeth kept her captive because she feared her. That fear was real, and it wasn't irrational. Mary became a focal point for Catholic plots and foreign interests. Letters and conspiracies swirled around her name. Then came the pivot. Mary was tried and condemned, and in 1587 she was executed. However you judge her guilt in any specific plot, the core truth is unavoidable. She was a queen reduced to a prisoner, then killed by another queen's government to remove a threat. Monarchy protecting itself with an axe. And speaking of threats the crown removed, let's talk about a rumour that sounds like modern tabloid invention, until you realise the monarchy literally changed its own name to survive a wave of public rage. The royal family that really changed its name to hide German roots. If you've ever heard the rumour that Britain's royal family rebranded itself to sound less German, you're not hearing a conspiracy theory. You're hearing a piece of First World War public relations that became permanent. The setup is uncomfortable. By the early 1900s, the British royal house was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German dynastic name inherited through Queen Victoria's family line. In normal times, that was aristocratic trivia. In wartime, when Britain was fighting Germany and public sentiment was boiling, German stopped being trivia and started being a liability. The rumour was that the monarchy feared being seen as foreign. The pivot is that in 1917, King George V changed the family's dynastic name to the House of Windsor. This wasn't a casual nickname. It was a formal decision reshaping how the monarchy presented itself to the public. At the same time, various relatives anglicized their own titles, shedding German-sounding names that suddenly felt dangerous. How do we know? Because it's in official announcements and the historical record of the court itself. No need for whispers when the change was openly declared. The consequence is revealing. Monarchy survives by looking native enough to be emotionally adopted. Windsor isn't just a castle. It became a brand, one designed to anchor the crown to English soil when the winds of war made ancestry feel like betrayal. Meanwhile, bloodlines have their own quiet weapons, sometimes literal ones, like a genetic disease that moved through Europe's palaces like a slow, invisible curse. The queen who really passed a bleeding disease into Europe's thrones. Royal gossip loves a dramatic curse, but in Queen Victoria's descendants there was something far more real and far more brutal than a superstition: haemophilia. The setup is that European royalty in the 1800s and early 1900s wasn't just interconnected, it was densely intermarried. Queens and princesses were political bridges between nations. Their children weren't only heirs, they were living treaties. The rumour was that Victoria's line carried a blood disorder that spread through royal families and killed princes. The pivot is that haemophilia, an inherited condition affecting blood clotting, did appear in Victoria's descendants and moved into several European dynasties through marriage. Boys who should have been protected by privilege could die from injuries that would be minor for anyone else. A fall, a bruise, a simple accident could become lethal. The most famous example beyond Britain is the Russian imperial family. The heir, Alexei, suffered from haemophilia, a fact that shaped the private terror of his parents and contributed indirectly to the rise of mystics and desperation at court. We can't always trace the gene with certainty through every branch without modern DNA, but the historical medical pattern is strong enough that rumour becomes documented family tragedy. The consequence is a cold reminder. Monarchy markets blood as destiny, but blood can carry fragility too. A dynasty can be conquered by something as small as the body's failure to stop bleeding. And speaking of bodies and dynasties, the next rumour is about a king whose understanding of love and power looked less like romance and more like a staffing decision, with consequences written into law. The king who really sold status and power to the highest bidder. James, I arrived in England in 1603 with a new crown and an old problem: money. Royal finances were already strained, and James's courtly style, generous, theatrical, hungry for display, didn't help, which is why one persistent rumour about him turned out to be painfully accurate. Honours could be bought. The setup is that in early modern monarchy, titles and offices weren't only about prestige, they were levers of power. Land, influence, and legal privilege could come attached. In a culture obsessed with rank, being made into the right kind of person changed your entire social universe. The rumour was that James created and sold titles to raise cash. The pivot is that the selling of honours, especially the creation and sale of baronetcies, was a known feature of James's reign. It wasn't hidden, it was discussed, criticised, and treated as a symptom of a monarchy that could be financially desperate enough to turn social order into a revenue stream. We know this because the pattern shows up in records. New titles minted, fees paid, arrangements formalised. Contemporaries grumbled because they could see what was happening. Status wasn't just inherited or earned, it was being priced. The consequence is corrosive. When honours are openly transactional, the mystique of divine hierarchy starts to look like a shopfront. It doesn't end monarchy, but it changes what people believe it is. And once belief shifts, the crown becomes just another institution, one that can be questioned, audited, and, if times get desperate, attacked. If you think that's cynical, remember, sometimes the most vicious rumour isn't about money. It's about the people orbiting royal bedrooms, especially when a mistress didn't just receive jewellery, but effectively gained political gravity. The mistress who really became a power broker in the king's last years. Edward III's reign is often remembered for war and chivalry. But late in his life, another name haunted the court: Alice Perrers. The setup is that kings age, and aging kings become vulnerable to flattery, to dependence, to the people who control access. Edward III, once vigorous, declined in his final years. The court became a place where proximity mattered more than ideals. The rumour was that a mistress dominated the king, took wealth, and interfered with justice. The pivot is that Alice Perrers was indeed Edward's mistress, and contemporaries treated her influence as both real and scandalous. Accusations flew that she used her position to extract gifts and manipulate legal outcomes. Parliamentary action against her, rare and telling, shows the extent to which her presence was viewed as politically toxic. She was at one point banished from court and stripped of property, though the story twists in later years with returns, negotiations, and the messy reality that power rarely stays neatly confiscated. How do we know this goes beyond gossip? Because it appears in political records and formal proceedings. When Parliament starts naming you, the whisper has become an administrative problem. The consequence is that mistress stops being a private label and becomes a constitutional anxiety. If a woman outside formal marriage could influence the machinery of rule, then the boundary between personal desire and public authority was thinner than everyone wanted to admit. And speaking of boundaries collapsing, the next rumour is a particularly vicious one, that the crown used secrecy not just to protect dignity, but to protect illness, because a monarch's condition could threaten national stability. The royal illness that really was managed like a state secret. We like to imagine royal health as a private matter, but historically it's been treated like military intelligence. The older the monarchy, the more allergic it becomes to admitting weakness. The setup is simple. A sick monarch risks panic. Investors worry. Politicians maneuver. Foreign powers watch. The press sharpens its knives. So the palace learns to do what any vulnerable institution does: control information. The rumour was that royal illnesses were hidden, minimised, and spun, even when the reality was serious. The pivot is that this pattern appears again and again, and it's not subtle when you look at how court communication works. Symptoms are described vaguely. Doctors speak in carefully chosen language. Schedules are adjusted without explanation. Officials insist everything is fine, while arrangements for succession or regency quietly move in the background. Even when illness becomes public, the framing often remains disciplined. It's fatigue, a chill, a minor operation, until it can't be contained anymore. This isn't about one single monarch, it's about the system's instinct. Whether it's the management of George III's episodes, the careful public presentation of later royal ailments, or the way the court has historically treated vulnerability as reputational hazard, the record shows a consistent strategy. Delay the truth, soften the truth, bury the truth if possible. The consequence is twofold. First, it keeps the machine running. Second, it teaches the public to distrust the machine, because when people sense spin, they start digging, and rumour grows in the space secrecy creates. And speaking of rumour filling the gaps, we're nearing the end of the corridor now, the point where these stories stop feeling like isolated scandals and start looking like a pattern. Power, image, and the constant fear of being seen as human. The crown that really survived by turning scandal into tradition. There's a reason these stories keep resurfacing. It isn't because people are uniquely cruel or uniquely fascinated by velvet and tiaras. It's because British monarchy has always depended on a kind of shared illusion, an agreement between rulers and ruled that the crown represents something steadier, cleaner, and more meaningful than the people wearing it. The rumour is that royal scandal is a modern invention, born from newspapers and cameras. The pivot is that scandal is older than print. Medieval chroniclers wrote it. Early modern diplomats reported it. Georgian satirists illustrated it. Victorian society whispered it. The 20th century filmed it. The only real change is speed. The crown's private life has always been a political resource, and when it looks unstable, everyone fights over who gets to control the story. And so, the true rumour here is structural. The monarchy survives by absorbing scandal into ritual. It turns crises into anniversaries. It turns personal weakness into national symbolism. It turns embarrassment into a carefully choreographed second act. A king loses a treasure train. The crown becomes a story of endurance. A queen is imprisoned. The dynasty becomes a story of continuity. An heir gambles, cheats, or testifies in court. The institution learns to smile harder and tighten access. A monarch's illness threatens stability. The palace becomes a press office. A marriage collapses in front of millions. The crown becomes a brand manager. The consequence is that the monarchy's most uncomfortable truths aren't just that royals behave badly, it's that the system often rewards, enables, or weaponizes those behaviors, because emotion is part of governance. Love becomes leverage. Grief becomes public mood. Sex becomes faction. Illness becomes secrecy. And the public, us, becomes both audience and participant, because attention is the fuel this machine has always run on. And speaking of patterns, we've now walked through 25 rumours that were stubbornly real, from medieval banquets to modern headlines, which means it's time to close the doors gently and leave you with the question that always lingers after royal history. What is the crown without the stories we agreed to believe? If there's a single lesson hiding beneath all 25 of these true rumours, it's that monarchy is less a family than a system, one that feeds on image the way a fire feeds on air. The people at the centre change, but the pressures don't. The crown demands heirs, loyalty, restraint, and performance. And when a human being fails at any of those, the institution does what institutions do. It protects itself first. That's why William the Conqueror can die as a leaking embarrassment and still be remembered as a titan. It's why Henry I's fatal appetite matters, not because lampreys are funny, but because a single death can crack open decades of conflict. It's why Edward II's favourites weren't just a bedroom rumour, they were a constitutional rupture. It's why Victoria's grief became a national debate, and why Edward VIII's romance didn't read as a private choice, but as a threat to the state's sense of moral order. And the darker truth, quietly threaded through every era, is that rumour thrives where power refuses transparency. When the palace hides illness, the public fills in the blank. When the court stages virtue, the audience searches for the outtakes. When marriage becomes policy and bodies become symbols, intimacy becomes national property, and the whisper becomes a kind of shadow archive. Some of these stories are tragic, some are grotesque, some are almost comically human, but none of them are meaningless, because each one shows you what the crown cost, not only to the people beneath it, but to the country asked to believe in it. So as you drift off, hold on to one last thought. British royal history isn't a line of perfect portraits. It's a corridor of closed doors, and behind each door is a human life squeezed into a political shape. If you enjoyed walking that corridor tonight, subscribe for more long, calm, fact-dense history, because the next set of impossible stories won't be any less real.